going to be looking at scratch building a mech. I've been thinking about doing this for years, so I'm always collecting sort of interesting bits and pieces when I find them and storing them away for future use. Now what spurred me to actually start doing this properly was that I was going through eBay a while back and I found some lighters which had some really interesting mechanical looking shapes. So what I've decided to do is actually to make a mould of this so I can cast up multiple pieces. So the first step here is just to pull this apart. And that's quite useful to do that because there's often some very interesting parts inside. But if I'm going to make a mould, I also need to make sure that this thing is sort of watertight, I suppose you might say, so that the silicone can't get inside it when I encase it in silicone. Now these bits are quite interesting. This is where the actual gas comes out of, but some really nice machined brass pieces, so I'm sure they'll come in useful for something a bit later on. So there's a lighter ready for casting, and I've just built a wall out of some foam board. As you can see here, I've put some old bits of other moulds in the bottom of the mould here. That's just to fill in some of the space so I don't use quite as much silicone as I otherwise would. Right, so they've now set, and as you can see, in order to get this out, what I've done is to cut the side. So I'm going to do the same for this one as well. And what I'm doing is just cutting a sort of a wavy line so that the two halves of the mould will go back together and they can't be misaligned. Right, so now I've got my mould ready to go. I'm just mixing up some polyurethane resin and pouring that in. This stuff's from a company called DWR Plastics and it's really easy to use, so I've just found myself using this stuff for everything. Right, and there's my cast lighter. So here's a variety of cast pieces that I've made for this project and also from previous projects. Some of these are pieces that I've machined on the lathe for a specific purpose. Others are just casts of various bits and pieces like the lighters. So some of these are casts from roll-on deodorants. The reason I'm using those is because they're actually effectively ball joints. So I thought they would work really well for shoulder joints, things like that. So my initial idea for these was to take these two lighters which have got the angled heads and put them end to end like that. And they remind me a little bit perhaps of like cylinders from an engine or something like that. So I'm just trying to arrange these in a sort of a logical way, and I kind of like the way that these pieces look together like that. Now what I need is a framework that all of these pieces can actually attach to. So what I'm taking here is a piece of MDF and I'm just going to cover it in styrene plastic so it's got a nice smooth finish. That will then give me a basic shape that I can then attach all my lighters and other cast pieces to. So there's my initial attempt there. And as you can see, these other lighters here will fit on the back. I'm just leaving these loose at the minute just because I'm not quite sure exactly how this is all going to go together. So I'm trying not to finalise things too much so I can adjust at a later date if I need to. I've also used this sort of Kinder Egg thing on the end of another lighter there. And I think that kind of looks a little bit like an engine or some sort of power plant or something like that. I've also got the ball joint from the deodorant bottle on the bottom. I'm figuring that that can attach to a waist part so that the upper body can sort of shift about as much as it needs to. What I'm also going to be doing is using this, which is just a model kit. I bought this specifically because it seems to have a lot of very tiny mechanical parts, so I think they're going to be really useful for adding detail onto the model as I go. So I'm thinking this sort of power plant piece might be sort of like the lower abdomen section of the mech perhaps. What I also need now is a sort of a chest and some shoulders as well. So what I'm thinking here is I can use this mould which I've made of a yogurt pot. Now it's often tempting to use yogurt pots and things like that because they've got some very nice sort of geometric shapes. The problem is though that they're often very flimsy, so they're not much use for actually making models because they'll just collapse under any sort of pressure. So what I decided to do for another project a while back was actually make a mould of a yogurt pot. That way I can pour in some rotocasting resin and just sort of replicate these as much as I like, and they'll also be a lot stronger than the yogurt pot would be on its own. And as with all of the moulds that I'm using for this project, I'm just filling them with polyurethane resin. So here are a few casts from the deodorant bottles that I mentioned earlier. Now you occasionally get some happy accidents when you're making things, and this project was no exception really. Luckily the deodorant bottles that I'd made casts of actually fit exactly inside these pieces, which are some eye sockets that I made for a previous project. So that's really handy. It sort of really looks like those two things were meant to go together, and I think they'll form some really good shoulder joints. So what I need to do is take my cast of this yogurt pot and attach it to the structure that I've already got here. So that's going to fit together like that, and I'm just going to add some super glue to attach that together. This is what I'm thinking. As you can see, I've got the sort of engine section as a sort of lower sort of abdomen area, and then the upper chest piece, which is made out of the yogurt pot, and the other pieces there. Now, in order to add some additional sort of visual detail here, I've got these casts which I've made of NO2 canisters. So I've got quite a few of these, so I think if I cut these up, these will be quite handy for creating additional detail. I'm also thinking that I can use some more casters and lighters to add some sort of further engine parts just sort of on top of the shoulders. So as you can see, I've sort of cut down those NO2 canister casts and glued those on, and I'm now just super gluing on these lighter casts as well. I'm not solely relying on super glue here as well. I'm trying to add sort of structural strength to it wherever I can, so I've got some wood in there as you can see, and I'm just trying to attach these lighter casts with some screws too. So I think that's a good start. I mean, it's basically looking like a bit of an amorphous blob at the minute though, so I need to sort of figure out exactly how this is all going to come together. Back when I initially started doing this, I actually decided to make some rough sculptures out of clay just to sort of try and visualise what the forms could look like. So these are some of the ones that I came up with, so you can sort of get a basic idea of where I'm going with this. I mean, to be honest with you, I really am making this up as I go along, and you often find that when you add certain pieces to the model, they sort of guide you as to how the overall piece should look. But I think it's useful just to have a basic sculpture and a basic shape in mind as you're going, so you sort of know partly where you're headed. Now I need to add some further detail to the back of this piece, and I don't want to keep using the same shapes that I use all the time, so I wanted to introduce some more variation. So what I did was to make a mould of this deodorant cap and make some casts of that. And what I'm doing now is just cutting those down to size on the bandsaw, and I'm trying to give them a bit of an angle so that they sort of stick out slightly. So I'm just trying to cut a piece of an indent into the piece there, so that when I glue it on, it will sort of be at an angle to the body. I'm also thinking that it can have some canisters sticking out the back. Now I don't want to use these NO2 canisters too much. I mean, I've got millions of them, but things do tend to get a little bit samey if you keep using the same shapes over and over again, and I've used these in hundreds of projects before. So I think what I want to do is actually make up my own canister shape here, something a little bit different from the NO2 canisters, because I think they are quite recognisable now. So that's the shape that I've come up with, and as you can see, it's quite different from the NO2 canisters, so I think that's cool. It's going to fit on the back like that, but obviously I need a few copies of this, so I'm going to make a mould in the same way that I have for all the other pieces for this project, and then cast up some copies in polyurethane resin. I also want to add some cabling detail. So what this is conduit, so it's basically plastic sleeving that you would put wires through, but it's got that really nice ribbed look to it, and I managed to find some stuff that's like 4.5, 5 mil wide, which is relatively small. So this stuff really looks the part, I think, so I want to attach that onto the model. It's also quite useful, I find, for hiding sort of rough edges, so I wasn't quite sure how to terminate the edge of this shape, but running a cable along it is a really nice way to hide that edge. As you can see, I've sort of capped that off with a piece of brass. So I've also made a sort of a waist section here. So I have two ball joints, which is where the legs will attach, and I've also got sort of a socket on the top, which is where the waist will slot into. So there you go, I've got sort of a ball joint on there as well. So in principle, that can move in any sort of orientation that I need. what I'm going to do is actually attach everything together with a big screw, and that should be strong enough to sort of hold everything in place. As you can probably see, I've got a piece of wood in the centre of that resin shape. That's just so I've got something to actually screw into. Because I'm sort of making this up as I go along, I'm having to try to think about how this will actually all hold together. Attaching all of these randomly shaped pieces together is a little bit difficult, so I'm just trying to piece this together in a way so it will actually all hold together when the thing's complete. So obviously I'm attaching all of these sort of geometric shapes together, and they're not all fitting exactly, so I do have some gaps and things I need to fill in. So what I'm doing here is just pasting on some car body filler, or Bondo as it's often known, and I'm just putting that into all of the gaps and scraping the excess away and sanding it all down to try and get a nice smooth finish. So what I now want to do is add some panel lines to the piece. So if you look at vehicles, you know, planes, tanks, things like that, they're not all made out of one piece of metal, they're made out of different shapes and panels and things which are bolted together. So what I'm going to do is sort of give that impression on my piece. So what I'm doing is scratching in some lines into the resin to try and create the illusion that this thing's made up of various panels and things that have been bolted together. The way I'm doing that is just using a variety of files and using some curved pieces of plastic to guide me. So I'm now at a stage where I can actually start adding a bit more fine detail. So this is called kitbashing, and I'm sure if you're watching this video you've got an idea of what that is. It's just taking pieces of model kits and other bits and pieces that you've found and adding them to the model to add a bit of sort of mechanical and visual detail to it. So what I've got here is a variety of styrene plastic strips and various other bits and pieces that I've found along the way. So pieces from the lighters that I dismantled earlier, and obviously bits from a model kit as well. So I'm just sort of gluing these onto the model to try and add as much mechanical detail as I can. As you can probably see, I've got some pipe work as well, and for that what I did was to go on eBay and get some soft aluminium wire. This stuff's really easy to bend, and I've just used that to add some sort of pipelines along the surface of the model. What I also want to do is add a few bolts and things, or rivets, to the model, and one way to do that is to use some sewing pins. Just snip the actual pin off, but to use the head as the actual rivet. So what I'm doing here is just drilling a few small holes, snipping the heads off some pins, and then gluing those in place. And I think they look quite convincingly like rivets. I think that works quite well. So I'm now turning my attention to the head of the model. What I've got is these brass portholes which are intended for scale model ships. So I'm going to use one of these in the centre of this piece here, which is another cast from one of the deodorant bottles. So what I'm doing here on the lathe is drilling a hole which is exactly in the centre of the piece, and that's exactly the diameter for the porthole, so that fits in there quite nicely. I'm also going to add some additional viewing ports, so here I'm soldering one of the portholes onto a piece of brass tubing. So it's going to sit in the piece just sort of slightly off centre like that. What that also means is I can attach some of this conduit onto the back to give it a sort of a bit of a neck. So skip forward a couple of hours, and this is how the head's currently looking. As you can see, I've used quite a lot of pieces out of the model kit here to add some additional detail to it. I quite like the look of that. I think that's looking pretty cool. So I need to figure out exactly how the arms and legs of this thing are going to look. At the minute it's sort of a bit of an amorphous blob of mechanical lumps, so I sort of need to try and figure out how this will actually look as a figure. So what I'm doing here is just using some plywood and cutting out some basic shapes to try and get an idea of how this could work. So here it is with some rough plywood legs, and I'm just trying to get an idea of what the actual pose of the thing will be. As you can see, I've got another cast of a lighter glued on here. I quite like the way that looks. I think I'm going to go with that as a pose and also as a sort of a structure for the leg. So with all my cast resin pieces on there, you can see how that's going to look. What I've got here as well is I think this is like a shock absorber from a remote control car. For the base of the feet, what I've also got is some more casts from some deodorant bottles, and I figured it would make sense that the feet would have ball joints in them so they can move to any orientation, so I think that sort of makes sense. I also want to put some sort of shin guards on here, and I found this deodorant bottle which has got quite an interesting sort of shape to it, so I thought that would look quite nice for the shin guards. Now obviously this is made of glass, so I can't really cut that down to size, so once again I've made a mould, and I thought it'd be kind of cool if the shin guard had a sort of a tapered shape to it. So what I'm actually doing is compressing the mould slightly, so that the actual cast piece that I get is like the deodorant bottle, but it's slightly tapered, and I think that should look quite nice as a sort of a shin guard there. So the shin guard's in place, this is how things are looking, and as you can see I've put together an arm here. Now I didn't want to start using the same pieces that I'd used previously in the model, so I decided to go down to the supermarket and get some more yoghurt pots, and this Milky Bar yoghurt looked pretty good, it's got quite an interesting shape. So obviously I had to empty the pot first and make a mould. So there's my mould. So what I've done is to pour in some rotocasting resin and to make a resin copy of that piece. So I've glued a few additional resin shapes onto that, and as you can see I've sort of created a basic arm shape. The lower arm is actually a small LED torch which I've had for ages, which I always thought would be useful for something. I've cut out some small pieces of acrylic plastic here to make the fingers, and I've just glued on some washers to give the impression that there's some hinges in there. So that's how things are looking. I've kit-bashed a few other pieces on there, and as you can see I've also made a gun which sort of hangs off the elbow. I had a few bits and pieces knocking about, and the centre piece there is actually from a roller blind, and the minute I saw it I thought that's going to be useful for a gun of some sort, so I've put that together from a variety of different pieces there as well. So this is it so far. As you can see I've also made another arm which is basically a large gun, and I've done that by using a piece of 22mm copper pipe, and I've just built up some styrene plastic shapes around that and then kit bashed more detail on top as well to give it some mechanical detailing. So there's the finished piece so far at least. Obviously it needs some paint, but I'll detail that in the next video. If you made it this far through the video, then thanks very much for persevering. If you're not subscribed, please do drop us a subscribe or a like, because it really does help the channel out. So anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.